I'm getting the distinct impression that the United States is not the only country in the world where billionaires are influencing everything from electoral politics to pop culture. Is that fair? Is that right?
It is, we think of India as being one of the world's poorest nations, but actually it's one of the world's most unequal nations. There are billionaires in India, and the numbers of billionaires are growing, and they often have played a similar role in perverting Indian democracy as American billionaires do, which is a really important factor given that India is in the middle of its 6 week long elections. Here in the US, we generally vote over the period of one day, or if you have early voting, it might run a few weeks in terms of people being able to mail in votes. But in India, take 6 weeks because we're talking about the world's largest democracy.
And so we have a situation, for example, here, as you know, political scientists, Martin Gillens and Page, I can't remember Page's first name, did a study published by Princeton University in 2015 or 16 saying that, basically saying that what oligarchs want in American democracy, oligarchs get, and if the majority wants it, and oligarchs also want it, the majority will get its way too. But basically, that money from corporations and the wealthy has distorted the U.S. And I don't want to overplay the comparisons with the U.S., but basically that money has distorted the U.S. political system. Is that also true in India, you think?
Absolutely. We have a situation where billionaires have been pushing for deregulation in India for decades now. India had had a very, relatively speaking, strong socialist infrastructure. It only became a country that was free of colonial rule in 1947. And so since then, it was established kind of quite remarkably as a secular democracy, a multi-faith secular democracy. It is home to numerous religious minorities. And, flawed as its ruling parties were, which was the Congress Party and in coalition with various communist parties, when the Hindu Nationalist Party, the BJP or the Bharatiya Janata Party, took over in 2014 and started winning elections, you started seeing this dismantling of regulations accelerate. So in the sort of 1990s, you had the beginning of deregulation. In the mid 2000s, that became even more pronounced. And now you're seeing Indian corporations and multinational corporations who do business in India really have their fortunes made on the fact that India is easing off of regulations in order to further corporate profiteering. And we're seeing this dismantling of public infrastructure. We're seeing crackdowns and oppressions on student movements, some things that are very familiar to us here in the United States. And you're seeing this Hindu supremacist, nationalist movement which is headed by the BJP, pay lip service to corporate profiteering while at the same time distract people with notions of lifting up Hinduism as the central religion, painting Muslims and Christians as dark forces seeking to subvert Indian democracy. It's very disturbing, and there's been hugely repressive movements and also movements by this Hindu majority against lower caste Hindus and Indians. It's a casteist movement. It's an anti-democratic movement, and it remains unfortunately powerful at the polls because they're very good at mobilizing voters. They're very good at using social media. India now has a massive AI problem where you're seeing a lot of disinformation kind of spread like wildfire through platforms like WhatsApp and, of course, traditional social media platforms that are just not vetted, and they're just spreading a lot of misinformation. So yeah, it's kind of a powder keg, and unfortunately, the BJP will most likely retain power.
And one of the things that is fascinating about it, I did a project in India, but I haven't been there in many years. It's changed enormously since then. And of course, when you talk about regulation in India, I don't have the impression it was over-regulated to begin with, in the sense that, for example, in the 1980s, you had the Bhopal disaster, maybe the worst industrial disaster in human history, and so on. But you did have this tradition, as you've described so well, of secularism, of multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies, a society rather, and the party led by Narendra Modi, the BJP, has been pushing this concept, Hindutva, I think they call it, of Hindu supremacy, as you point out. And a couple things have occurred to me about that. One is you mentioned their organizing skills, which seem to be considerable. I'm reading a book about it now by an Indian sociologist. And it seems that, among other things, they're even at times able to, at least they're trying to persuade, for example, the so-called intouchable class to embrace their caste as a sort of sacred role with it. They're trying everything to get to every Hindu group they can. But it seems to me, thinking about the billionaires and the obscenely wealthy and the corporations and so on, that as in the United States under Trump, for example, so many organizations and individuals that profess, and I don't know that this is true, but I'm wondering, in the United States, we certainly saw that all sorts of corporations and individuals who professed for decades a rejection of racism, of bigotry, of hostility towards immigrants or minorities of any kind, suddenly found that when push comes to shove and dividend came to stock buyback, that they found it very easy to work with a nationalist or supremacist political leadership. Is that happening in India as well, you think?
Oh, well, absolutely. The elites in India are very pro-Modi. Corporate elites, wealthy individuals, wealthy families are very pro-Modi. They see the BJP as their best bet for, retaining their position at the top of the hierarchy. And just like they do here in the United States, there's this myth, this sort of ethos built around capitalism and predatory capitalism as good for everybody, that it lifts all boats, a rising tide lifts all boats. And indeed, the BJP recently released, earlier this year, released figures and government figures in India that attempt to show how the Indian economy is faring, in as much as it impacts ordinary Indians. And these figures, by the way, were 10 years too late. It took them a decade to come up with these figures, and they finally did come up with figures that were pre-pandemic, but still magically appeared to show as though extreme poverty in India had fallen to 5% of the population. And so it spawned all of these glowing headlines. How did India and the BJP perform this miracle of reducing extreme poverty to 5% of the population? And it turns out that it's just them fudging the numbers, right? I mean, this is an election year ploy to recast the current economic system as benefiting the majority of Indians. Meanwhile, you see Indian corporations minting money and the lower income Indians basically continuing to struggle. You see the kinds of bizarre displays of conspicuous consumption, which was the focus of the story that I wrote recently for Independent Media Institute. The Ambani wedding is such a showcase of disgusting billionaire wealth. And just to give it a little bit of background for your audience, Mukesh Ambani is India's richest man, or he was India's richest man. He is now not only India's richest man, he is Asia's richest man and the 11th richest man in the world. And his youngest son is getting married. And the pre-wedding, which took place in March in a small town in Gujarat, cost over 150 million US
Wow.
dollars. Okay. To put it into context, British royalty doesn't spend nearly that much. Like Harry and Meghan's wedding cost all of 43 million US dollars. Mukesh Ambani's son's pre-wedding was $152 million, 1,200 guests, 3 days. They flew in Rihanna to paid her $6 million to perform live for the guests. They flew in Mark Zuckerberg and a lot of these CEOs, Sundar Pichai of Google, and Bollywood superstars were there. This was the pre-wedding. The actual wedding is taking place in July in London. And unlike American billionaires who, kind of like hide their wealth in the shadows a little bit, Indian billionaires are more than happy to display it, more than happy to throw their dollars around. There were like 1,200 different dishes that are being made, or maybe hundreds and hundreds of different menu items. And these are spawning headlines, the custom jewelry and the custom clothing. It's shocking, the perverseness and the obscenity of the wealth in a nation that still has a majority poor people. And we're still fresh from the massive farmers' protests in India
I
that
was going
have.
to ask about the farmers' protests, and in general, Sonali, I was going to ask whether um, people might react to this conspicuous wealth any number of ways, including rising up, which is, phrase familiar to you, rising up in outrage and fury and, like the English Civil War, killing the wealthy in their homes, burning them to the ground. But it doesn't seem that that's what's going on in India. I mean, do people like this? Is it kind of like British royalty where they get some sort of vicarious thrill from it? Well, what's the public reaction to all of this?
Well, a lot of people are making fun of it. A lot of people are ridiculing it. It's a huge country. It's a diverse country. You will find all the reactions. You'll find the fawning over the wealth. You'll find the folks who consider it a matter of pride that India has billionaires now, and lots of them. And then you have the very, very active left movement in India skewering these displays of wealth. And you just even have like folks in pop culture laughing about it. I mean, I enjoyed, and I link it from my story, a like 15-minute YouTube video by a couple of young influencers, very hip influencers who, I mean, if you know Hindi, you can understand it, but it is, they ridicule these billionaires like anything. One of the guys on screen, like, pretends to be catching money flowing from the sky, and he's like, oh, it was just the Ambanis flying overhead in their jet, and one of them sneezed and rained a few dollars down on us, right? So they are making fun of them, which is good. I kind of find it refreshing that these billionaires are showing their colors. They're showing who they are. They're being honest about the obscenity of their wealth. And it's important because it's an important reminder for all of us, not just Indians, but all of us around the world, that there should be no such thing as billionaires. Billionaires should not exist in a world where we have so much inequality. We only have billionaires because we've got masses of people at the bottom that are impoverished, because billionaires are formed from sucking the wealth out of the rest of us. If they
Right.
didn't do that, they wouldn't be billionaires.
Of course, absolutely. And what about the left? I know, before we go, you had the farmers' strike, which may have been the largest political action of its kind in history, as far as I know, certainly many millions of people. You have the left parties, including, I think, the Communist Party has, for a long time, controlled Kerala, maybe one or two other states. Where is the left? And I mean, I guess there's no chance it's going to win on the national level, and I don't know if there's any political organizing going on, but is the left moribund in the middle of all this, or could this eventually put more wind in its sails? What do you think?
Well, those farmers' protests in India were incredible. They brought the country to a standstill. And that was them protesting against the same kind of deregulation of agriculture in India that Reagan ushered in here in the United States, that ended up, having small family farms gobbled up by big agriculture, not ensuring a minimum price for their produce and for their crops, so that basically they remain at the whim of the market, and commodity their crops are commodities that are traded. And so Indian farmers were absolutely up in arms, rightfully so. They brought the government to a standstill, and eventually Narendra Modi had to back down from implementing these laws, but has not completely said that they won't do it either. And actually, there's some indication that the farmers' protest might be resurging as we speak in India as well, to which potentially could hurt Modi's re-election chances. We'll have to see. The elections go through till early June, because remember, we're talking about more than a country of 1.4 billion people, and in terms of eligible voters, it's nearly a billion eligible voters. So we'll see how it plays out. And you also brought up Bhopal earlier. This year is the 40th anniversary of the Bhopal disaster, the worst industrial accident in world history, when Union Carbide, a company now owned by Dow Chemical, had a major gas leak at its plant in Bhopal, a very poor part of India. And this deadly leak killed thousands and is continuing to poison subsequent generations. And Dow Chemical has refused to properly compensate them. It's tied up in US courts, it's tied up in Indian courts, and it's been 40 years since that disaster. I mean, most Americans have probably never heard of Bhopal, but the worst disaster, hands down, industrial disaster in world history. And the victims are still demanding compensation. And you don't see Indian capitalism doing much about addressing that. Those things don't figure into their calculations. It's a cost-benefit analysis, and it's worth the cost of business to allow for accidents to happen, and not to place as much emphasis on things like safety or basic health and taking care of the actual people who live in the country. So I
And
hope
that
people
Indian government had its flaws, but they put the Union Carbide executive in jail for that, which
it
is
is.
something we all should learn from
It
it.
did.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.